My father told me that walking me down the aisle would disrespect my stepmother. He said it 2 weeks before my wedding, sitting on the edge of my childhood bed while I held my dead mother's pearls in my lap. I'd only come over to pick up those pearls. My grandmother left them to me before she passed, and my mom wore them at her own wedding before she died when I was 12. I wanted to wear them when I married Nathan. I was flipping through an old photo album when my dad knocked and sat down and told me he had something important to say. I actually thought he was going to get emotional about his little girl getting married. Instead, he told me he wouldn't be walking me down the aisle. He said Diane felt it would be inappropriate for him to walk me when he'd already walked her daughter Kennedy down the aisle 3 years ago. He said if he did the same thing for me, it would look like he was playing favorites. I just stared at him. I reminded him that I was his actual biological daughter and that Kennedy was his stepdaughter of 8 years. He told me that biology doesn't determine family and that I needed to be more considerate of Diane's feelings. I asked whose idea this really was. He admitted Diane brought it up, but that he agreed with her logic. I sat there holding my mother's pearls, trying to understand how my father could walk a stranger's daughter down the aisle at her wedding but refused to do the same for his own child because it might upset that same stranger. I asked him if he heard how backwards that sounded. He told me I was being selfish and that marriage was about compromise. I said I wasn't married to Diane, so I didn't need to compromise with her. He said that attitude was exactly why Diane felt unwelcome in our family. I wanted to scream that Diane had made me feel unwelcome in my own family for 8 years. Instead, I took my pearls and left without saying goodbye. Here's what you have to understand about the 8 years leading up to that moment. My mom died when I was 12, and my dad married Diane 4 years later. Diane came with Kennedy, who was my age, and from the second she moved in, there were 2 categories of daughter in that house. There was Kennedy, and there was the other one. Diane threw Kennedy a sweet 16 and forgot my birthday the same year. When Kennedy got married 3 years ago, Diane spent 11 months planning it like a royal coronation, and my dad walked her down the aisle and cried. I sat in the 4th row. Nobody kept score out loud, but Diane kept score in everything, and my dad had learned a long time ago that the easiest way to keep peace in his house was to let me be the one who lost. The 2 things my dad kept from my mom were that box of her jewelry, which he said he was saving for the girls, and the fact that he could always still say the words, "I love you," right before he chose Diane. I took the pearls that day. I left the jewelry box on his dresser. I want you to remember that box, because it comes back later, and it's the part that still makes my hands shake. When I got home and told Nathan what my dad said, he was so angry he stood up and started pacing. He offered to go talk to my father man to man. I told him not to bother, because my father's mind was made up the second Diane opened her mouth. Nathan sat back down and took my hand and asked who I wanted to walk me instead. I told him I'd walk myself before I'd give my father the satisfaction of watching me beg. But my dad wasn't done. 3 days later, he called me with what he clearly thought was a generous offer. He said he wanted to help pay for the wedding. A real chunk of money. Then came the condition. He said the money came with the expectation that Diane would have a meaningful role. In the day, he floated ideas. Maybe Diane could be part of a special family blessing. Maybe there could be a blended family dance where Diane and Kennedy joined in. Maybe, since him walking me was off the table, Diane could stand up front with him during the ceremony so it felt like everyone was included. I realized what I was hearing. My father was offering to buy Diane a mother of the bride role that she had done absolutely nothing to earn using money at my wedding for a mother who wasn't dead but sitting in his kitchen. I told him I'd rather pay for the whole thing myself. He said I was being dramatic and that most brides would kill for that kind of help. I told him most brides didn't have to sell a seat at their own wedding. Then I hung up and called the venue and put the rest of the balance on my own card. And honestly, writing that number down felt better than his money ever would have. Diane took over from there, because of course she did. She called me 3 times to explain that she really did see me as family and hoped I understood her position. I didn't answer. Kennedy texted saying she thought her mom was being ridiculous, but that she didn't want to get involved. I didn't answer her either. Then Diane started in on the guest list. She emailed my aunt, my dad, and 2 of my cousins to say that if she and Kennedy weren't seated in the front row and given appropriate recognition, they might not attend at all, and wouldn't that be sad for everyone? My dad backed her up. He texted me directly and said Diane was his wife and she belonged in the front row, and that seating her anywhere else would be a public insult. I texted back that the front row was for the people who raised me. Then I called my aunt and asked her to make sure Diane and my dad were seated in the second row, not the first. For about a day, I genuinely considered not inviting them at all. In the end, I decided I wanted them there. I wanted them to watch. So I made 2 decisions and told exactly 2 people about the second one. First, I would walk down the aisle alone. Second, I quietly removed the father-daughter dance from the entire program. I told Nathan, and I told the DJ, and I told no one else. Diane, meanwhile, kept pushing that blended family dance idea through my aunt, and I never said yes and I never said no. I just let her keep planning something that was never going to happen. The day of my wedding, I felt strangely calm. We got married at a vineyard outside town. Nathan's family filled one whole side of the aisle, and my little collection of aunts and cousins and college friends filled the other. My dad and Diane and Kennedy sat in the second row, exactly where I'd put them. When the music started, I walked down the aisle by myself. I kept my head high and my eyes on Nathan waiting at the end of it. I didn't look at my father once. I didn't need to. Nathan cried during his vows, which made me cry too. When we were pronounced husband and wife, we walked back up the aisle together and the whole vineyard cheered. At the reception, my aunt gave a toast that made everyone laugh and then cry. Then Nathan's father asked if he could have a dance during a slow song. We moved out onto the floor and he told me he was honored to have me as a daughter, that his son had chosen well, and that I always had a family with them no matter what. His eyes were wet. I cried again, but for once they were the good kind of tears, the kind that come from being wanted instead of tolerated. I realized, standing there, that this was what a father was supposed to feel like. My aunt found me a little later and squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. She leaned in and told me she'd been waiting 8 years to watch someone in this family stand up to that man, that she was proud of me, and that Nathan was a keeper because she could tell he had a spine. Nathan's mother kept refilling my water and telling me to eat something. His college friends adopted my college friends within an hour, and by the time the sun started going down, the two sides of the aisle had blended into one loud, happy table. I remember standing at the edge of the dance floor watching all of it, and thinking this was the first family event in a decade where I wasn't bracing for something. I wasn't watching Diane's face to see if I'd done something wrong. I wasn't counting how many photos she took of Kennedy versus me. For one evening, I was just a bride at her own wedding, and I hadn't realized until that exact moment how tightly I'd been holding my shoulders for 8 straight years. Then came the part I'd been waiting for. The DJ got on the mic and announced that we'd be skipping straight to the bouquet toss. No father-daughter dance. I watched my dad's face from across the room, confused, then hurt, then angry. Diane leaned over and whispered something in his ear and he stood up and walked toward me. He found me near the cake table and asked, in this tight voice, why there was no father-daughter dance. I looked at him and said there was no father to dance with. He said that was cruel and unnecessary. I told him that walking your daughter down the aisle was a tradition too, and he decided traditions didn't matter when they inconvenienced his wife, so I figured I'd apply the same logic. His face went red. He opened his mouth, and that's when Diane made her move. She'd apparently told the DJ earlier that there'd be a special family dance, because suddenly a song she'd picked started playing. And Diane stood up and gestured for Kennedy and my dad to join her on the dance floor, like she was hosting her own event at my reception. She stood out there in the middle of the floor with her arms half raised, waiting. Nobody moved. My aunt looked at me. Nathan's cousins looked at each other. Kennedy stayed frozen in her chair, going pale. The song played to a completely empty dance floor while Diane stood there realizing, in real time, that she was performing to a room that wasn't going to give her the moment she'd scripted. Nathan's brother Damon walked over, not aggressively, just calmly, and stood between Diane and me like a wall, and asked the DJ to move on to the bouquet toss. The song cut off. Diane's face did something I'd never seen it do before. It cracked. She came at me instead. She grabbed my arm and said, in that smooth, practiced voice, that I'd embarrassed my father in front of everyone and that's not how family treats each other. She'd clearly rehearsed it on the walk over. For a second her face brightened like she thought she'd landed a hit. Then I pulled my arm out of her hand and turned my back on her and walked straight over to where Nathan's parents were standing by the bar. I didn't look back. I could feel her behind me, trying to figure out what just happened. My dad and Diane left about 10 minutes later, and they made a whole production of it, gathering their things loudly and saying goodbye to people near the door in these carrying voices. A few guests looked uncomfortable. Kennedy didn't leave with them. She stayed hunched over a drink at a corner table, looking like she wanted to sink through the floor. And here's the thing nobody tells you. The reception got better after my father left. It sounds terrible, but it's true. The whole room got lighter, like someone opened a window. People laughed louder and danced more and stopped throwing worried glances at our little drama corner. Kennedy found me near the end of the night. She was twisting her hands together, and she said she needed to apologize for not speaking up sooner about her mother, that she'd spent her whole life learning to just go along to keep the peace. But watching me set a boundary tonight made her realize how messed up their whole dynamic was. I told her I understood, but that I needed some time. She nodded fast and said she'd be there whenever I was ready. 3 days into our honeymoon, the email came through while we were having breakfast by the pool. The subject line was in all caps. W helk abiloyo or bihalir. Nathan read it over my shoulder and started laughing, this genuine amazed laugh, and then I was laughing too, at the sheer nerve of a man who refused to walk his daughter down the aisle deciding he needed to lecture me about behavior. I deleted it without reading past the first line, which started with, I am very disappointed. Nathan flagged down a server and ordered us 2 ridiculous tropical drinks with fruit and little umbrellas, and we toasted to not letting my father invade our honeymoon. We didn't check our phones again for the rest of the day. When we got home, there were 2 letters waiting in the mailbox, both from my dad. The first one said I'd caused a scene at my wedding by removing the father-daughter dance without warning and that I'd disrespected Diane. The second one was longer and angrier and said I'd changed since I met Nathan, that Nathan was manipulating me, and that Diane was heartbroken and I owed her an apology. Both letters demanded I call him immediately to discuss this like adults. Nathan pulled a chair up next to me at the kitchen table and we wrote a response together. I typed and he helped me make it firm without being cruel. The letter said that his choice not to walk me had natural consequences, that removing the dance was mine to decide, and I wouldn't apologize for protecting myself, and then it laid out boundaries. No unannounced visits to our home, no using other relatives to guilt trip me. Any future relationship would require real accountability from him. Not, I'm sorry you were hurt, but actual ownership of what he'd done. I read it 3 times and hit send in the morning. 3 days later my aunt called, and she sounded almost gleeful. Diane had been calling everyone in the family. My cousins, my uncle, relatives I barely spoke to. She was telling all of them that I'd humiliated my father at my own wedding and that I was vindictive and cruel. My aunt laughed when she got to the good part. Most of the family shut Diane down immediately. My cousin Sarah told Diane that my father humiliated himself the day he refused to walk his own daughter. My uncle told her he didn't want to hear it and hung up. Even my grandmother's sister, who I hadn't seen in years, told Diane she was out of line. My aunt said she just wanted me to know I had more support than I probably realized. I'd spent 8 years thinking the whole family saw me as the difficult one, because that's what my dad implied every time I complained about Diane. Turned out they saw right through her. I hung up feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Not everyone got it right, though. A couple of my own friends took Diane's calls and believed her, because Diane is very good and she can cry on command. One of them, a woman I'd known since college, sent me a long message about how she thought I was being harsh with an older woman who was only trying to make peace, and how family is family, and how I'd regret this someday. I read it twice, then I muted her and I didn't respond, because I'd figured out by then that anyone who hears one side of a story and immediately picks the side that isn't yours was never really on your side to begin with. Freya. She showed up that same night with wine and takeout and said, anybody who needs to interview both parties before they'll believe you got hurt isn't your friend, they're a juror, and you don't owe a juror anything. I lost 2 friends that month. I found out they were never the kind worth keeping. Then Kennedy called, and she was crying, and she told me the thing that turned my stomach to ice. She said she couldn't stop thinking about the wedding, and there was something I deserved to know. Years ago, when Diane was planning Kennedy's wedding, Diane went into my dad's closet and took my mother's jewelry box, the one he was saving for the girls. Diane told Kennedy the pieces were just sitting there doing nothing, and had 2 of my mother's rings reset into new settings for Kennedy to wear on her wedding day, and sold a 3rd one, a gold bracelet, to help pay for the flowers. Kennedy said she hadn't known at the time whose they were. She figured it out later, and she'd been sick about it ever since. And she couldn't watch me get married without me knowing that a piece of my mother had literally been melted down and reshaped so Diane's daughter could sparkle. I sat down on my kitchen floor. My mom died when I was 12. That box was one of maybe 4 things I had left of her, and I'd left it on my dad's dresser because I trusted, on some stupid level, that he'd keep it safe. And instead the woman who wanted to erase my mother had taken her apart, ring by ring, and handed the pieces to her own kid. I called my dad. I didn't yell. I told him what I knew and I asked him to return whatever was left of my mother's jewelry. There was a long silence. Then he said, in this tired, careful voice, that it was a long time ago and I should let it go, that dragging it up now would only cause more pain for everyone, and that Diane didn't mean anything by it. He said Diane felt terrible. He actually said Diane felt terrible. That was the moment I stopped waiting for my father to become a different person. He wouldn't even protect a dead woman's rings from the woman who dismantled them. He would choose Diane over my mother's memory, over me, over anything, every single time, until the day he died. I told him I'd send him nothing more except through certified mail, and I hung up. 2 weeks later, he showed up at our apartment. I was still in my pajamas on a Saturday morning when I heard the knock. Nathan was in the shower. I looked through the peephole, and my father was standing in the hallway looking angry and determined, and my whole body went cold. The knocking got louder. He started saying he knew I was home because my car was in the lot. Nathan came out of the bathroom with a towel around his waist, took one look at my face, and pulled on sweatpants faster than I've ever seen a man move. He walked to the door and opened it just enough to fill the frame. His voice was calm. He told my dad he needed to leave, that showing up unannounced violated the boundaries I'd stated in writing. My dad tried to push past him and Nathan didn't move an inch. My dad started yelling that I was his daughter and he had a right to talk to me. I stepped up beside Nathan and told my father, through the gap in the door, that he needed to respect my boundaries or there'd be no relationship at all. He looked at me like I'd slapped him, and he said I'd never acted like this before Nathan, that Nathan had turned me into someone he didn't recognize. And Nathan actually laughed this quiet surprise laugh and said maybe I never had anyone standing behind me before, so I never got to find out who I was. My dad opened his mouth and shut it again. He had nothing. He stood there another few seconds waiting for one of us to fold, and when neither of us did, he turned and walked away down the hall. Nathan closed the door and locked it, and I realized I was shaking, but underneath the shaking there was something new, something that felt almost like power. We called Nathan's parents an hour later, still rattled, and they told us to come straight over for dinner, because that's what they do. They close ranks around the people they love. That night at their kitchen table, Nathan's mother put her hand over mine and said she was sorry my father couldn't see what an incredible daughter he had. And I felt that old familiar grief for the dad I was never going to get. But I also felt something steadier underneath it, which was the realization that I wasn't standing out in the cold anymore, pressing my face against the window of a family that kept the door locked. I was already inside a different house, one that had been holding a chair for me the whole time. My father spent years telling me that family is about compromise, that I had to bend for Diane, that blood didn't mean what I thought it meant. And the strange thing is he was half right. Blood didn't mean what I thought it meant. It just didn't mean what he thought it meant either. It turned out family was the people who opened the door before you even knocked. If my dad had just gone quiet after that, this would be a sad story about a father who chose wrong. But Diane couldn't leave it alone, and that's what turned the whole thing. Because while my dad was licking his wounds, Diane went online. She posted a long, teary story about how she'd tried for 8 years to love her husband's difficult daughter, how she'd been shut out of the wedding and blamed for everything, how cruel young women can be to the stepmothers who only ever wanted to help. She tagged mutual acquaintances. She played it perfectly. Some people commented with sympathy. And then a woman named Patricia, who'd worked with my dad for 15 years and had been at Kennedy's wedding, commented with a screenshot. It was a post from Diane's own account, from years back, taken at some family barbecue. In the caption, next to a photo of Diane holding up a champagne glass, Diane had written, "Time to upgrade this family. These two girls are going to learn real quick who the actual daughter of this house is." Patricia's comment was one line. "For the record, this is what you said before you spent 8 years pretending to love her." The post went off. Other people from my dad's world started chiming in, remembering things. The time Diane called me the leftover kid at a Christmas party. The time she forgot to save me a plate at Kennedy's graduation dinner. The rings. Somebody who knew a jeweler confirmed the resetting story. Within a few days, Diane wasn't the brave stepmother anymore. She was the woman who melted down a dead mother's jewelry for her own kid, and everybody knew it. She locked her accounts. It didn't matter. The screenshots were already everywhere that mattered. About a month into all of this, I found out I was pregnant. Nathan and I stared at the 2 lines on the test in our bathroom for a full minute before he picked me up and spun me around. But the joy got complicated fast, because that night in bed I asked him what role my father would have in this kid's life, and neither of us had an answer. We actually talked about just not telling him at all. About keeping the whole pregnancy quiet, letting my dad find out our daughter existed sometime around her first birthday, if ever. Nathan said whatever I decided, he'd back me, but that our kid came first, always. I didn't get to decide, because my aunt let it slip on a phone call with my dad when he asked how I was doing. She called me right after, mortified, saying it just fell out of her mouth. Within hours I had an email from my father. The subject line said congratulations in all caps. He assumed, right there in the first paragraph, that he'd be an involved grandfather. He suggested nursery colors. He asked when we'd find out the gender. He talked about a visitation schedule. Not one word about the wedding, or the rings, or my mother. Just an open assumption that a new baby meant a clean slate and a door back in. I wrote back one email. I told him that being a grandparent was a privilege earned through respect and healthy relationships, not an automatic right that came with a birth announcement. I told him that until he could look me in the eye and admit that refusing to walk his biological daughter while walking his stepdaughter was wrong, and that letting my mother's jewelry be taken apart was wrong, he would not have access to my child. I told him I would not raise a daughter who had to learn, the way I did, that she came second to somebody's feelings. He didn't apologize. He escalated. A week later, a letter came, and this one had Diane's fingerprints all over it. He wrote that he'd been thinking about his estate. He wrote that he'd always planned to divide everything fairly between his daughters, meaning me and Kennedy, but that if I was going to keep his grandchild from him, he'd have to reconsider what was fair. He wrote that he hoped I'd think about my child's future before I made this permanent, and that a lot could change in a will. It was a bribe and a threat in the same envelope. Grant Diane access to my baby, and there'd be money someday. Keep the boundary, and he'd cut my kid out. I read it twice to make sure I understood. Then I wrote back 3 sentences. I told him he could not buy my daughter, and he could not use her to buy his way out of what he did. I told him to leave whatever he had to Kennedy, or to Diane, or to a cat, because we would be fine, and my child would never know she was born into a negotiation. I told him not to contact me again about money. Then I blocked his number, and I felt nothing but tired, and under the tired, relief. Kennedy was the one who finally broke ranks completely. She asked to meet me for coffee across town where we wouldn't run into anyone, and she showed up looking older than I remembered, and she told me everything. She told me about growing up walking on eggshells around Diane, about how her mother turned every good thing into a competition and kept score in a notebook in her head. She told me Diane had spent years quietly making sure Kennedy came out on top of me in every single comparison, and that Kennedy had let it happen because it was easier than being the one Diane turned on. She told me the rings had haunted her for years. And she told me she'd signed a lease on her own apartment, and she was moving out of Diane's orbit for good, and that watching me hold a line at my wedding was the first time in her life she understood that she was allowed to. We talked for 2 hours. I saw my stepsister clearly for the first time, not as Diane's golden child, but as another girl who'd been shaped by the same narcissism, just pointed in the opposite direction. When we left the cafe, she hugged me, and I let her. The last letter from my father came when I was 7 months pregnant. I knew it was from him before I opened it, but the handwriting was different this time, shaky. Some words pressed so hard the pen almost tore the paper. It was 2 pages. He wrote that he was sorry I was hurt by his decision about the wedding. He wrote that Diane's feelings had to be considered too, because they were married, and that's what marriage meant. He wrote that he hoped I could understand his position now that I was married myself. He said he was excited to be a grandfather and asked when the baby was due. Nathan read it standing next to me at the counter, and when he finished, he pointed at the second paragraph. He said, "Do you see it?" I asked what. He said, "Your dad is apologizing for your feelings, not for anything he did. There's no line in here that says walking Diane's daughter, but not you was wrong. There's no line about the rings. It's just, I'm sorry you feel bad, now let me meet the baby." And he was right. Under all that shaky handwriting, it was the same non-apology it had always been, dressed up to look like remorse. I wrote back one more time, and this one was clean and calm. I told him I appreciated him reaching out, but that saying sorry for how I felt was not the same as being sorry for what he did. I told him that until he could name the actual thing, out loud, we had nothing to discuss. I told him being a grandfather was earned, and he hadn't earned it, and the choice was entirely his. I sent it in the morning with Nathan sitting beside me, and then I closed the laptop and went back to folding tiny clothes. He wrote back once more weeks later, and this letter had no demands in it at all. He wrote that he missed me. He wrote that he wished things were different. He wrote that he didn't know how to fix this without betraying Diane. He wrote that he thought about me every day, and that the sentences trailed off in places like he'd lost his train of thought. There was no mention of the wedding. No acknowledgement of what he'd done. Just an honest admission that he was choosing Diane over me and couldn't figure out how to do anything else. It was almost worse than the manipulation. At least the manipulation was trying to get something. This was just a man telling me he knew he was wrong and was going to keep being wrong anyway. I filed it in the folder with the others and went back to the baby clothes. Meanwhile, Diane's world kept shrinking. The people who mattered had made up their minds. My dad's friends stopped inviting them to things. Patricia's screenshot had done what 8 years of my quiet complaints never could. Diane had built an entire identity out of being the wronged, patient stepmother, and her own words had burned it to the ground. And she was left sitting in the ashes of it with a husband who'd traded his whole family for her and now had nothing to show for it. I didn't gloat. I didn't have to. She'd handed everyone the truth herself, and the truth did the rest. The family I actually had, meanwhile, kept showing up. Nathan's parents invited us for dinner one Saturday, and halfway through the meal his mother cleared her throat and said they had something to show us. She'd converted their guest room into a nursery for when we visited with the baby. She pulled paint samples out of her purse and spread them on the table and asked which color I liked best. She was asking my opinion. She was including me in a decision about my own child. I pointed to a soft yellow and my throat got tight, and she smiled and said that was her favorite too. Nathan's father said they'd already ordered a crib. We found out at the anatomy scan that we were having a girl. Nathan cried in the exam room, and driving home, I made a decision that felt like closing a circle. My grandmother's pearls? The ones I'd gone to pick up the day this whole thing started, the ones my mother wore at her wedding, would go to my daughter someday. Diane had taken apart everything of my mother's she could reach. But she never got the pearls. They'd been safe in my hands the entire time, and now they had somewhere to go. Down the line, Diane spent 8 years trying to erase. My aunt threw me a baby shower in May. Nathan's whole family came. My cousins came with their kids. Freya calculated exactly how many diapers we'd need for a year and bought all of them. And my aunt gave me my mother's baby blanket, the one thing of my mom's she'd quietly kept safe all these years, because she'd never trusted that house either. Kennedy came too, and her gift was last, a photo album of the two of us when we were younger, before Diane, before all of it got complicated. Nobody mentioned my father. Nobody needed to. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, I started seeing a therapist. I went in thinking I needed help figuring out how to handle boundaries with my dad. What I actually needed help with was forgiving the version of me who spent 8 years making excuses for him. For a long time, I'd been quietly ashamed of how long it took me to fight back, like the fact that I'd tolerated it made me stupid, or made it partly my fault. My therapist said something I keep coming back to. She said, "You weren't stupid. You were a kid who lost her mom and wanted her father to love her, and people who want to be loved will explain away almost anything." She said the wanting wasn't the weakness. The wanting was the most human thing about me. I cried in her office more than I did at my own wedding. But I walked out of there able to hold two things at once, that I'd been manipulated, and that being manipulated didn't make me a fool. And somehow holding both of those at the same time was the thing that finally let me put it down. Diane did try one more thing. About 2 weeks before Claire was born, a padded envelope showed up at our apartment with no return address, but I knew that handwriting. Inside was one of my mother's rings, or what was left of it, the one Diane had reset for Kennedy. She'd had the stone put back into something closer to the original setting, though it wasn't the original. It couldn't be, and there was a note. The note said she hoped this could be a fresh start, that she wanted to be a grandmother to my baby, and that she was giving back what mattered to me. As a sign of good faith, she thought she was returning my mother to me. She never once understood, that you can't melt something. She'd taken a ring my mother wore, cut it apart, handed the pieces to her own kid, and now she was mailing me a different ring made of the same gold like it was the same thing. Like a person is interchangeable with the pieces they leave behind. Nathan asked if I wanted to keep it. I said I'd keep it for Claire, so that one day I could tell her the whole story, including the part where the people who love you right are the ones who never once make you audition for it. I didn't write Diane back. Some gestures aren't olive branches. They're just the last move of someone who still thinks everything is a transaction, and I was done transacting. Our daughter came 6 weeks later on a Tuesday morning, after a long hard labor with Nathan holding my hand the whole way. When she finally came out crying and perfect, the nurse laid her on my chest. The hospital room filled up within hours. Nathan's parents came first, and his mother cried holding her. My aunt came with flowers. Freya came straight from work still in her scrubs. Kennedy showed up with a giant teddy bear and wet eyes. They all took turns holding her. Kennedy held her the longest. She sat in the chair by the window with Claire, tucked against her chest, and didn't say anything for a while, and then she looked up at me with her eyes full and said, "She's going to grow up so different than we did." Yeah, she is. That was the whole conversation, but it was also everything. Both of us understanding exactly what the other one meant. Two women who'd been raised to compete finally standing on the same side of the room. My aunt had brought my grandmother's pearls to the hospital because I'd asked her to. I don't totally know why I wanted them there. Maybe I just wanted my mother in the room somehow. I held them in my hand while the nurse checked Claire's vitals, this string of little white beads my mom wore at her own wedding that my grandmother wore before her. And I thought about the whole line of women it had traveled down to reach my palm, and about the one woman who'd spent 8 years trying to cut that line off and hand it to somebody else. She never touched these. That's the part I kept coming back to. Diane got the rings, and she lost everything else, and she never once touched these pearls, and someday they were going to hang around my daughter's neck like proof that some things can't be taken, no matter how hard somebody grabs for them. Nathan's mother asked what we were naming her. We said Claire, after my mother. She smiled and said that was perfect. I looked around that room at all the people who'd shown up, who'd celebrated with me through the pregnancy, who'd stood behind me through all of it, who were here now to welcome my daughter into the world. My father's absence was a permanent loss, and I felt it sitting there. But it was also the clearest thing I'd ever understood. I hadn't lost a family. I'd finally figured out who mine actually was. People who show up without conditions. People who love without keeping score. Claire is gonna grow up wearing her great-grandmother's pearls someday. She's gonna grow up knowing exactly where she stands, which is first, always no exceptions and no competitions. She'll never sit in the 4th row at her own family's events wondering what she did wrong. She'll never have to earn a seat at a table that should have always been hers. She'll never find out, the way I did, that a parent's love can come with a rank attached to it. My father spent my whole life teaching me that I came second. It took me 20-some years and one wedding I walked down alone to finally disagree with him. 2 years of this, and for the first time, my house is quiet, and it's ours, and there's a little girl asleep down the hall who is going to know, every single day of her life, that she was chosen first, and that's worth everything.